Okay, so we might kick off now. So it's a pleasure to welcome everyone. I'm Alan Barrett, the director of the ESRI, and it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to today's webinar. So as you all know, we're going to be talking about immigration for the next hour and a half. And maybe slightly unusually, we're actually launching two reports in today's webinar. So again, old friends of the Institute and people who've been following the work in this area for quite some time will know that for the last, I think since 2010 approximately, we've been doing an annual monitoring report on integration. And so the first study that you'll be hearing about today is the latest issue of the Integration Monitoring Report. And my colleague Fran McGinnity will be talking about that report in a couple of minutes. But in addition, given the sort of the very unusual year that, of course, we're living through, we thought it would be a good idea to have a more COVID-specific piece of work both done and presented here today. So a little bit later this afternoon, my colleague Shannen Enright will then talk about that second study. So again, slightly unusually for the last number of years in doing this, I'd now be thanking and welcoming our colleagues from the Department of Justice and Equality. But as everybody, again, most of you will know, the integration dimension of the Department of Justice's work has moved over to the old Department of Children. So now it's my great pleasure to welcome our colleagues in the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. So we'll look forward to working with you guys in the coming year on these issues. And again, nice at this point to be able to pay tribute to the great partnership and collaboration that we have with our colleagues from the Department of Justice over the last number of years, who began this research program and worked very, very constructively with us over the years. So again, in line with the new department, today we'll have the official launch of the two reports will be done by Minister Roderic O'Gorman. And although Minister O'Gorman wasn't able to join us live today, he did produce an address earlier that we're going to play. So in a moment we'll do that, and then straight after that we'll get into the presentations of the two reports that have been launched today. So with that, can we have Minister O'Gorman's presentation, please?
Hi everybody, I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to join you live for this event, but I'm delighted for the opportunity just to share a couple of thoughts with you about it. And I want to warmly welcome the publication of the Integration Monitor. While it's one of a series of such reports now published every 2 years, it's the first to be published since I became the line minister responsible for integration policy a couple of weeks ago. And I'm very interested in its findings, in particular what it can tell us about working in integration policy and where we might need to renew our efforts or even rethink our approach in certain areas. And the National Migrant Integration Strategy is a whole of government framework for integration policy and practice, and it sets out a vision of an Ireland where migrants are supported to participate fully in Irish society, where their fundamental rights are guaranteed, access to mainstream public services is assured, and additional targeted supports are provided to help people overcome any barriers to participation. And the strategy was due to be completed at the end of this year, but I've agreed that its date for implementation should be extended out to the end of 2021, because like so many areas of society, due to COVID, there have been delays in implementing some of the action points. So we're going to give ourselves an extra year to fully implement this strategy. And I chair the Integration Strategy Monitoring Committee, and that's going to continue to meet through that additional year. And we're going to make use of that time to commission an independent evaluation of the current strategy, and this will inform the successor strategy that we design. But so too will our engagement with all of you who work in the field of integration policy and within the wider integration community. And I look forward to initiating that particular process early next year. in light of today's particular publication, the Monitor gives cause for both optimism but also some cause for concern as well. It's good to see that the majority of Ireland's migrants are integrating well, they're economically active, they're well dispersed geographically, and they're experiencing broadly similar outcomes to the native population on many dimensions of integration. And for certain groups, though, the picture is less positive, and I'm eager that our new integration strategy will create and include concrete and measurable plans for addressing these areas of concern. Recent policy and legal changes have supported integration. So, for example, many asylum seekers can now gain access to employment following changes and much needed changes that were made in 2018, and further advances in this area of access to employment are being implemented at the moment. The new international protection accommodation policy, which I'm going to deliver to replace the current direct provision system, will see many asylum seekers transition to independent living in the community, and which, together with increased supports, will greatly facilitate integration. And as a separate development, I've recently received the interim report of the Independent Anti-Racism Committee, which is developing a new national action plan against racism for recommendation to government next year. And racism is obviously one of the biggest barriers to integration, and I look forward to meeting with the committee before Christmas to discuss their interim report. And by adopting a new action plan, and it'll be the first action plan that Ireland's had since 2008, but an action plan that's ambitious, that's achievable and is measurable, we hope to bring new energy to the fight against racism in our country. So just to conclude, I want to congratulate the authors of today's report. I am very pleased that my department is able to support this research under the Equality and Integration Research Programme within the Institute. And my thanks in particular to Dr. Fran McGinnity, who leads this programme, which provides important objective evidence for integration policy and for integration policy for policymakers and practitioners alike. And I want to wish you all every success with today's launch. Thanks very much.
You probably know my name is Fran McGinnity. I'm an Associate Research Professor here at the ESRI, and I'm going to present the Monitoring Report on Integration 2020. As Alan said, this is the 7th Monitoring Report that I've been involved in, so I'd like to welcome some old friends and some new faces, hopefully, though I can't see anybody, of course, but I hardly need to tell you, as Alan also mentioned, this year is very different. So we're publishing a short COVID report with the monitoring report, and Shannen, my colleague Shannen Enright, is going to present this after me. The COVID pandemic has been a major challenge to all of us this year, but it's also challenging to research as things are changing fast. Turning to this monitor, the data in this monitor is pre-pandemic, but our understanding is that is an understanding of the pandemic and associated labour market shock will be informed by the situation prior to the pandemic. So if you like, I'm doing the scene setting, and my colleague Shannen is presenting the companion report, COVID and non-Irish nationals. As Alan and the Minister said, both these reports come from a programme of research on integration with the department. So we're building up an evidence base, if you like, and it's very rewarding for me as lead researcher to see this evidence base build up. Just to say, we don't look at the impact of Brexit in this report or the next one. It's too early to assess at this stage, but so we just have to wait. But as you'll see, there's plenty going on. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen now. So you should see the monitoring report on integration. So now, as you'll see from this report, this is very much a team effort. There's a very long list of authors who all contributed. I'm the lead author, but other authors contributed in their area of expertise. I'm presenting on behalf of these authors today. I'd also like to thank, sorry, just getting myself sorted. The report also benefited from steering board comments, input from ESRI colleagues and different government departments commenting and providing information on their particular area. We also couldn't have done this without input from and assistance from CSO statisticians and our ESRI publications team, in particular Sarah Burns, who managed a tight turnaround on these reports. So, monitoring integration, what's it about? Our key question then is, how are non-Irish nationals integrating into Irish society? Migrants need to find a place for themselves, find a home, a job, income, schools, access to healthcare in their host country. Integration as a process is difficult to define and may indeed mean different things to different people. So we focus on 4 key areas of life in this monitor: employment, education, the educational sphere, poverty and social inclusion, and citizenship. As I said, this data is pre-pandemic, but it sets the scene for the companion report, which focuses on the early impact of COVID. As you'll now know, this is the 7th in a series of monitors. The whole monitoring exercise is to provide policymakers, many of whom are in the audience, and the general public with facts to assess integration and respond to policy challenges, or in this case, also a COVID-19 pandemic. We focus on integration outcomes, though policy is included in reference throughout the report, in particular the migrant integration strategy, which is the main policy instrument in this area. Just as a further bit of background, we compare Irish nationals to non-Irish nationals throughout the report. Nationality, or being an Irish citizen, affects work and residence rights, and group comparisons are useful. So it means something rather different if non-Irish nationals have a 15% unemployment rate and Irish nationals do too, than in the case where Irish nationals have a 5% unemployment rate and non-Irish nationals have a 15% unemployment rate. So throughout the monitor, you'll see these Irish, non-Irish comparisons. And then we distinguish, in as far as we can, we distinguish the groups further, because EU nationals, as many of you will know, can live and work in Ireland without restriction. The situation is very different from those who come from outside the EU. Non-EU nationals, they need a work permission and they need a residence permission. As you might also know, most non-Irish nationals are from other EU countries. That's 3/4. So nationals of other EU countries make up the bulk of non-Irish nationals in Ireland, and that's important to bear in mind. We use the best data, we would say, that we can find, high quality national data sources. They were designed specifically to monitor integration, which throws up some challenges for them. Also, of course, we use different data sources. It's not the same data source for the labour market indicators as for the poverty and social inclusion indicators. Sometimes we need to use different years because the latest data for each of the life domains, as we call them, aren't actually the same. So in case you're wondering why sometimes it's 2019 and sometimes it seems to be 2018, that's the reason for that. And sometimes then we combine the years. In research, we call that pooling the data. This is to try and give some bigger sample sizes, because while there are plenty of non-Irish nationals, sort of overall, there's a great diversity in this group. over 100 nationalities. So with the rules from CSO that we don't want to disclose anybody, we do need to often group the categories together. I'll come back to that at the end, just to say that you know, we try our best to distinguish groups, but if you want to know more about particular countries of origin, you should check out our one of our earlier publications called Origin Integration that used the census data and looked at individual countries of birth. So now, looking at the labour market indicators, employment is important, as many of you will know, for financial security, for migrants' contribution to Ireland, to their contact with others. I'll ask you to cast your mind back here to 2019. What sort of shape were we in then? So we had rising employment and falling unemployment for both Irish and non-Irish nationals. And in fact, in 2019, employment rates were actually higher for non-Irish nationals at 73% than for Irish nationals overall, though there is some variation within the groups. Looking at unemployment overall, the rates were very similar, slightly higher for non-Irish nationals, but the gap had narrowed and it was no longer statistically significant. So 6% for non-Irish and 5% for Irish nationals. And this, as you will realise, is low. Looking now, though, a little at the group, the different group rates. Here we have, I'll just see if I can get a pointer up. This is Irish here in red, and here you'll see that particularly for the EU group, UK is still counted as EU for the purposes of this monitor in 2019, and the rates, particularly for this EU West and EU East, their employment rates are high. Of course, not all jobs were created equal. They command different pay rates and different conditions, and Shannon's going to talk a little bit more about differences in the kind of jobs that non-Irish nationals do in her presentation. You will notice here that the non-EU groups, their employment rates are lower. NAO is North America and Oceania. So that's basically the US, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, and Africa, Asia and the rest of the world. So some of these lower employment rates are because people have come to Ireland to study or for other reasons and not to work. But student migration has been particularly dominant in migration trends in recent years. So possibly a better indicator of labour market disadvantage is unemployment. So unemployment are people who are in the labour market, they're actively seeking work, but they cannot find a job. Here we see fairly low unemployment for most of the groups, but much higher for African nationals. And this has been a pattern that has persisted. The rates for everybody have fallen in recovery, but the African disadvantage in terms of unemployment has persisted since we started monitoring integration in 2010. Turning now briefly to education. Education then is skills for life, play a significant role in improving subsequent outcomes, particularly labour market outcomes for immigrants, and how an education system integrates immigrant children is a key component of integration policy. So if we compare the educational levels of the adult population, non-Irish nationals are actually more likely to have a third level qualification than Irish nationals. That's the whole working age population. But you might be saying to yourself, well, you know, aren't they younger? Aren't non-Irish nationals younger? And that's true. But even when we look at young adults, the proportion with a third level education is still higher for non-Irish nationals overall. So Ireland is not a low-skilled migration country. There are, however, some differences between the groups. This chart shows educational outcomes with the the national groups broken down as before, showing the share of young adults with third level education. So here we've got the Irish on the left And here we see very high, the EUS group are very highly qualified, as are those Anglophone North Americans and Asians, also those from the rest of the world on average. Africa, slightly higher, but still on average, this group has higher qualifications than the Irish 25 to 34-year-olds. EU East nationals have lower rates of third level education. So they're an exception to the general pattern of higher education among non-Irish nationals. How migrant children are performing in school is sometimes seen as a more accurate assessment of how well the education system is integrating its immigrants, given that most Irish, non-Irish nationals came to Ireland as adults and were educated elsewhere. In the integration monitor, we do, as before, use the OECD PISA test results as an international survey at age 15. We distinguish the 15-year-old students by their place of birth and their parents' place of birth, and the language spoken at home. So we have first and second generation migrants, and then we also have, we distinguish those by whether they're from an English speaking background or a non-English speaking background. And here we find, as we found in previous monitors, that mean reading scores are lower among first and second generation migrants from a non-English speaking background, but there's no difference in reading scores between migrants from English language background and their Irish peers, and there's no difference between any of these groups in their scores in mathematics and science at age 15. Turning now to social inclusion, I realise a bit of a whirlwind tour through life domains, but I don't want to keep people too long. We use the survey of income and living conditions to measure poverty and social inclusion among non-Irish nationals, and here we find that the at-risk of poverty rates are somewhat higher for non-Irish nationals compared to Irish nationals, and they're particularly high for that non-EU group, and they're particularly low among the EU West, which, as you saw, are a very highly educated group with high labour market participation. Deprivation is an alternative measure that doesn't rely so much on current income. It's an alternative measure of social inclusion, and it records households who are lacking 2 or more basic items like food, clothes, heating. In 2017-18, they didn't differ between Irish and non-Irish overall. Consistent poverty then combines the two. So that's people who are both income poor and deprived, not able to achieve that sort of standard of living that allows them to afford food and clothes. And consistent poverty rates for these years were also very similar for the two groups overall, but they were higher for the non-EU group and also for the UK group. But this higher rate for the non-EU group in both income poverty and consistent poverty is also something we found in previous years. Some other indicators of social inclusion are self-reported health. Non-Irish nationals report better health on average than Irish nationals. Part of this difference is due to the younger average age, as self-reported health is very strongly linked to age. So the UK, the older group, as we call them, the UK nationals, their health is very similar to Irish nationals, but the other groups report better health. Another indicator from the Zaragoza indicators of integration that we use, I can talk a little more about them later, is home ownership, and it is much lower among non-Irish, 28%, than among Irish households. So this is a very dramatic difference. Home ownership is high in general in Ireland. It's certainly high among the general population, but it's not high among non-Irish nationals. Again, slightly higher among the UK, but all other groups show very low rates of home ownership. So what does this mean? I guess the big significance for us now in the midst of a housing crisis is that private renting is much higher for non-Irish nationals. 2/3 of the non-Irish nationals group as a whole live in the private rented sector, and they are then vulnerable to insecure tenancies, rising costs, and potential issues with their living conditions. Finally, our fourth life domain is active citizenship, and these figures are taken from administrative data at the end of 2019. Citizenship of the host country may be viewed as the highest level of membership, if you like, available to migrants. And in our previous Origin and Integration report from June, we do find a positive association between labour market outcomes and having acquired Irish citizenship for non-EEA nationals. Over the years, we've documented a remarkable rise in the acquisition of Irish citizenship in Ireland. It peaked in 2012. 150,000 non-Irish nationals acquired citizenship through naturalisation since records began in 2005. Based on administrative data and a correction from the census microdata that assumes that 10% of those who naturalised subsequently left Ireland, we estimate that 37% of those of non-EEA origin are now Irish nationals. So that's a substantial proportion of the population of non-EEA origin. So these figures relate to non-EEA. For anybody who doesn't know, the EEA also, as well as EU countries, it also includes Iceland, Norway and Liechtenstein, but let me tell you that it doesn't make much of a difference. Most of those who were naturalising in what we call the first wave were non-EEA nationals, and you can understand that because there's a lot more to be gained from having Irish citizenship in terms of security of residence and work rights for non-EEA nationals. But interestingly, we do see a trend towards acquiring Irish citizenship by EEA nationals, and the top nationalities in 2019 then were actually Polish, UK and Romanian. So there's certainly been a rise in acquisition of Irish citizenship by UK nationals in the last couple of years. Just looking here at the trends over time, if you look at this kind of, I guess it's the royal blue bar is certificates issued to non-EEA nationals, and here you'll see the very dramatic rise up to 2012 and then falling naturalisation certificates to this group, as well as falling applications. And here, this navy bar you see, so is certificates issued to EEA nationals, which around 2010 was very, very low, but started rising, and now actually is very similar in terms of for the 2019 figures in terms of Irish citizenship naturalisation certificates issued. So now, takeaways. If there are 4 things you should remember or things to take away, is that in 2019, there was high employment among non-Irish nationals, especially EU nationals, and low unemployment, except African nationals. Non-Irish were highly qualified in general, less so EU East. For reading outcomes at 15 languages important. Social inclusion, consistent poverty rates were similar overall, but higher for non-EU, and citizenship acquisition has changed the nature of the non-EU population has changed the nature of the non-EU origin population living in Ireland, and naturalisation trends have shifted towards acquisition by EU nationals. Just turning briefly now, before I finish, to some of the challenges, some of the lessons for monitoring. As I said at the beginning, we use exceptional, I would say, national surveys from the CSO, but they're not designed to survey migrants. They have small migrant samples, and this is particularly a problem for monitoring poverty, because we can't distinguish poverty and deprivation rates among the non-EU group, though we strongly suspect that this varies quite a lot given given the variation in labour market outcomes for this group. And then, because there's no migrant survey in Ireland, we rely on these sort of general indicators. We don't have any sense of belonging, intentions to stay, all the things that you would get in a large survey of migrants in Ireland, but there isn't one. So we have no information on this at a sort of bird's eye overview level, which is the level this monitor is operating at. The increase in naturalized migrants, which is of course very positive for integration, presents a challenge if we're monitoring integration on the basis of nationality, because many who came from outside Ireland have now, even outside the EU, have now acquired citizenship. If you like, it's a sort of own goal for integration monitoring, in the sense that while as integration outcomes rose rapidly, we need to think carefully about who we're capturing in that definition. There are moves afoot to add parents' country of birth to the labour force survey and motives for migration. That's planned for 2021. I don't know if it'll get pushed on now to 2022 with the pandemic, but I'm cautiously optimistic that by the next monitor we'll have more scope to develop a possibly more accurate measure of the population. We can't directly monitor the integration outcomes of asylum seekers or refugees using the data we have. We've been drawing attention to this for a number of years, but it's very clear to me now that we need to be able to do that and think creatively about how we should do that. I see good potential in administrative data to monitor integration. Here we're relying chiefly on surveys. There's been some promising initiatives here. We did a report on data for monitoring integration as part of this research programme and outlined the challenges and opportunities. There's also an exciting initiative by the CSO who've done an equality data audit of many administrative data sources that we could possibly use. But in both survey and administrative data, it is important to mention that ethnicity remains very rarely measured in data in Ireland. It's not measured in any of the ongoing surveys. It's in the census, it's in the Growing Up in Ireland data and occasional ad hoc surveys. But this is especially relevant for the Anti-Racism Committee. And if the government and the Anti-Racism Committee are serious about tackling racism, they need to be able to measure it. Finally, in terms of policy issues, we see one of the issues of concern is poor labour market outcomes for African nationals. There are likely to be multiple factors underlying this, but from previous research, we suggest that time spent in the asylum system is likely to be a contributing factor. In that report from June on origin and integration, we found that having come through the protection system was associated with poor labour market outcomes. So supports, integration supports for successful applicants would indeed be very useful. Another report I led for the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission found that the Black ethnic group experienced much more discrimination in the labour market than other ethnic groups, both in seeking work and in the workplace. Another point is about housing and homelessness, where the indicators are quite different actually for Irish and non-Irish, at least the headline indicators, and housing and homelessness is not identified They're not identified as actions in the migrant integration and the current migrant integration strategy, and probably should be. The findings from Monitor do, well, certainly we think as authors underscore the importance of renewing the migrant integration strategy, and I was very pleased to hear that it will be, that's what the government are planning from the Minister's address. Of course, engagement of other departments, local councils and NGOs are important here. In fact, everybody in Ireland, because integrating migrants into Ireland is not just a job for the government, it's a job for everybody in the country has a responsibility and a role to play. So if you want to read any further, the report's available on the ESRI website. It's up there already, and as we said, it's part of a programme of research, so you can read some of the others if you're interested.
Okay, so now I'll be presenting some of the findings from our complementary report on COVID-19 and non-Irish nationals in Ireland. My name is Shannen Enright, and I am one of the authors of this report alongside Dr. Frances McGinnity, Dr. Ivan Pravalko, and Dr. Helen Russell. Let me see if I can get this away here. Perfect. Okay, so just to provide you with a bit of background as to why we carried out this research. So since the emergence of the pandemic, migrants, foreign citizens, and asylum seekers have been identified as particularly vulnerable to the direct and indirect effects of COVID-19. And these can include anything from economic issues, risk of infection, but also derogatory or xenophobic language. Now, migrant workers may also represent a particularly vulnerable workforce during the pandemic due to the nature of the work in which they are typically employed. So previous research, both inside and outside the EU, has found that migrants are overrepresented in both essential occupations and those hardest hit by the crisis. Although which migrant groups are the most vulnerable varies depending on the country. So the plan for this report. So this report set out to examine the early impact of the pandemic on non-Irish nationals in Ireland using the latest available data at the time. And based on early findings from other countries, we set out to examine 3 key ways the pandemic has impacted non-Irish nationals. One, to examine the labour market outcomes. This included falls in employment and temporary absence from work due to COVID. This here would be business closures for the lockdown rather than illnesses. And 2, to examine the proportions who could be classified as key workers, as well as look at differences across key sectors. And then also to examine whether non-Irish nationals have been disproportionately impacted by COVID cases or deaths. And we also examine differences across ethnicities here as well. So how did we analyse these impacts? Well, the analysis in this report again uses the most recent available data at the time of writing. Analysis of employment pre-pandemic and essential workers draws on labour force survey data from 2017 to 2019. And then analysis of the impact of COVID on employment uses Q1 and Q2 data from the 2020 LFS. Now, Fran touched on this a bit earlier, but whilst using labour force survey is beneficial, as it is an expansive nationwide survey, there are limitations due to the fact that it is a survey of private households and thus excludes the homeless, those living in emergency accommodation, residential institutions, and also direct provision accommodation centres. And then figures presented on deaths and cases come from the computerized infectious disease reporting database. These figures were matched to census data from 2016 by the CSO to permit identification of non-Irish nationals and ethnic minorities. So in total, 69% of records were successfully linked, which equates to about 49,169 confirmed cases of 71,187. So just looking at employment pre-pandemic, as touched on by Fran earlier, overall employment rates are high among non-Irish, especially those from within the EU, as shown in the previous presentation. However, there are significant differences in the types of jobs that Irish and non-Irish nationals do. So from this graph, we see that non-Irish nationals are significantly more likely to work in industry, accommodation and food services, information and communication, and the administrative and support sectors. However, this does hide divergent effects for non-Irish national groups, as you'll see on the next slide here. So this chart shows the proportion of all employed in each nationality group in some various sectors, just to give you an idea. So looking at the health and social work sector, which is the dark blue colour here, we see that those from the UK and non-EU nationals have similar or higher levels of participation in this sector compared to Irish nationals. Looking at industry, which is this kind of medium blue colour here, overall, most migrant groups are prevalent in the industry sector with higher rates of participation compared to Irish nationals, with the exception of the non-EU group here. So 9% of all EU nationals employed work in this sector. And then finally, the accommodation and food sector, which is the lightest blue colour here. So both Eastern European nationals and those from the non-EU group have high participation rates in the accommodation and food services sector, where few Irish workers are found. So you see there's only about 6% of Irish nationals employed actually work in the accommodation and food services sector. So moving on to look at the decline in employment between Q1 and Q2 of 2020, we see that the accommodation and food services sector, arts and entertainment, and the administrative and support services sectors were the hardest hit during the pandemic between Q1 and Q2. We know that non-Irish nationals are overrepresented in sectors hit by job loss. For example, non-Irish nationals are more than twice as likely to work in the accommodation and food sector, which it has seen the largest decline in employment here. So part of the public health response to COVID was to ask employees to work from home where possible. And non-essential workers who are unable to work from home are therefore more likely to lose their jobs. So in this research, we construct a measure of remote ability based on patterns of remote working prior to the pandemic. Now, this was constructed at the occupational level and then applied to everyone within that occupation. And as we see here, Eastern European nationals are the least likely to be able to work from home, with 73% in occupations with low remote ability pre-pandemic, whereas Western European and non-EU nationals are more likely to occupy jobs that can be done from home compared to Irish nationals here. So moving on to look at results on the probability of employment during the pandemic. So the results presented in the graph here are from a model controlling for age, gender, family status, occupation, and sector. And in this analysis, we count those who have worked for pay or profit during the week before the survey as being employed. And then the dependent variable in the model is being employed versus not employed. So that would include people who are unemployed, inactive, or temporarily absent. From modelling, we found that overall the odds of employment are more than halved between Q1 and Q2. And then looking at this fall across nationality groups in this chart here, we see that the fall in employment is much sharper for the EU East nationals, which is this light blue line here. And we also find that differences in sector and occupation don't account for the disadvantage of the EU East group. So the graph shown here looks at the decline in employment from Q1 to Q2 for both men and women. We can see that for both men and women, the decline in employment was similar for Irish, Western European, and non-EU nationals, but that the fall in employment was sharper for EU East nationals, represented by the light blue line here again. And the drop was particularly sharp for women from EU East countries, which is this light blue line here. Now, looking at job loss and remote ability, overall job loss is sharper among those in occupations with low remote ability, which is this dark blue line here, which was expected as non-essential workers who can't work from home would be more likely to lose their jobs if the businesses they worked for had to close during the pandemic. We find that controlling for the remote ability of occupations also does not alter the interaction between Eastern European nationals and Quarter 2. And in addition, our models also showed that looking at age, the decline in employment among those aged over 30 is also larger for Eastern European nationals. So moving on to COVID-related absences. COVID-related absence is defined as someone not in paid work during the reference week, but had a job or business that they were away from and they expected to go back to it. And the reason that they were not at work was related to COVID. So this could include temporary business closures due to health measures and social distancing, but it is also likely to pick up those taking paid or unpaid leave to deal with childcare or other demands caused by the pandemic. This measure will exclude workers who lost their job due to COVID, where the business closed permanently, or those who did not expect to be taken back by their former employer. Again, we see here that Eastern European nationals have significantly higher relative risk ratios of COVID-related absence compared to Irish nationals, holding age and gender constant. And then when we control for family status and education, non-EU nationals are also found to have higher risks of COVID absences, but differences in occupation and sector fully account for the greater risk among non-EU nationals. A test of the interaction between nationality and gender again shows women are more vulnerable to COVID-related disruptions. We also find that the gap between women from Eastern Europe and Irish nationals is significant after controlling for occupation and sector. We also examine the interaction between nationality and education and find that graduates from Eastern European countries fare worse than Irish graduates. So moving on to look at key workers during the pandemic. So we know that key workers are not only essential for the country's COVID response, but may also be more vulnerable to the virus. And this is particularly true for those working in health professions whose infection risk is much higher than other professions. In this research, our definition of key workers expands on the definition of essential workers used by Redmond and McGuinness in the early stages of the pandemic to include employees deemed essential in the more recent pandemic period. Using this definition, there are 12 broad categories of key workers. Those would include health professionals, health associate professionals, other health employees, armed forces, defense and public administration, retail sales, transport operatives, education workers, agricultural employees, workers in utilities such as electricity and gas and waste management, and those working in the manufacturing of specific products. We find that overall, Irish nationals are significantly more likely to be defined as key workers compared to non-Irish nationals, which you'll see on the next slide here. So looking at this graph, while a lower proportion of all non-Irish nationals are classified as key workers, rates of key work vary within the non-Irish group. So a lower proportion of workers from Western European countries and the rest of world group are classified as key workers compared to Irish nationals. and all other non-Irish national groups. But African and Asian workers are the most likely to be key workers among non-Irish national groups, with proportions more closer to that of the Irish nationals. And we also examined differences in proportions of key workers across various sectors, such as health and related sectors. So we know that healthcare and related sectors contain one of the most at-risk labour forces for contracting COVID due to the nature of their work, which involves close proximity to and treatment of those with the COVID virus. This is reflected in the number of cases linked to COVID outbreaks among healthcare workers. As of the 27th of November, 17% of the cumulative confirmed cases linked to COVID-19 outbreaks were among healthcare workers. And these kind of cases among healthcare workers have been consistently high throughout the pandemic, rising to a high of 35% by the 17th of April. So looking at the proportions of different nationality groups within this sector, while those from the UK, North America, Australia, and Oceania have a similar share working in the health and related sectors as Irish nationals, Eastern European nationals and the rest of the world group have significantly lower levels of employment in this sector. But most notably, African and Asian nationals have significantly higher rates of employment compared to Irish nationals and all other non-Irish national groups. So looking at COVID cases by nationality and ethnicity, this graph presents the proportion of cases by ethnic group and also shows the proportion of the population in each ethnic group. Now, not pictured in this graph is the white Irish population, who represent 79% of cases, but 82% of the population. We do find that ethnic minorities are overrepresented in COVID cases. Those of Asian ethnicity are 2.3 times as likely as white Irish to contract COVID. Those of Black ethnicity are around 1.9 times as likely as white Irish to contract COVID. And Irish travellers are 2.6 times as likely to contract COVID as the white Irish population. So the high levels of participation in health and related sectors seen in the previous graphs among Asian nationals may potentially explain the high rates of COVID cases seen among Asian or Asian Irish ethnic groups compared to the white Irish. Similarly, most African nationals are Black, so their high rates of key work in the healthcare sector may also partly explain the higher rates of contracting COVID-19 among the Black ethnic group. Looking at nationality, non-Irish nationals made up 12.1% of reported cases, but only 11.4% of the population. However, the story on deaths is actually much different to cases. Overall, ethnic minorities are less vulnerable to deaths from COVID-19. For white Irish travellers, Black or Black Irish, or Asian Irish, there were fewer than 5 deaths, if any, until the 24th of November. Part of the lower death figures here is likely to relate to the different age profiles of the groups. So between March and November of this year, 92% of COVID-19 deaths were among those aged over 65 years. Now, less than 3% of the ethnic minority groups are aged over 65, but this is true of just over 10% of the white Irish population. Similarly, less than 5% of non-Irish population are under 65, compared to almost 15% of the Irish national population. However, it is important to note that these figures are incomplete and may change, and numbers in some of these groups are quite small. So looking at some of the limitations of the research, although we aim to include as many key workers as possible in the analysis, There are constraints to analysing such groups using existing data and definitions, and as such, our definition may not be exact. We also know that the definition of key workers has shifted multiple times during the pandemic already. Now, a clear limitation of this report is that we combine groups with different characteristics. In particular, the labour market impact analysis does not allow us to distinguish different non-EU groups, though we know this group hides considerable variation, as discussed by Fran earlier. In addition, the survey and information used does not allow us to distinguish the impact of the COVID pandemic on asylum seekers and refugees who have been found in other European countries to be a particularly vulnerable workforce. Finally, another obvious limitation of this analysis is that it is still very early to assess the impact of the pandemic, as it is not at all clear how public health measures, including business closures and other restrictions, will evolve over the coming months, and whether the patterns observed to date will remain consistent. Finally, just some brief conclusions. So the pattern of labour market impact which emerges is not entirely consistent with the experience of other countries. However, the findings do reflect some broader patterns of labour market integration previously observed in Ireland. In particular, the disproportionate impact of the previous recession in Ireland on the employment of Eastern European nationals. The occupational segregation found by nationality does have implications not only for employment, but also for risk of contracting the virus, with frontline workers more at risk of contracting the virus, especially those in the healthcare sector. Now, we do find that ethnic minorities are overrepresented in terms of cases, but this is not the case for deaths. But again, this may be partially attributed to the younger age profile of these groups. And then finally, just to reiterate, this provides a snapshot of the early impact of the pandemic on non-Irish nationals, and these patterns may change in the coming months. Thank you for listening, and the report is available for download now on the ESRI website, and we'll now open up the floor for some questions.
Great, thanks so much for that, Shannon. Again, lots of really interesting information, I have to say, very well presented. So thanks so much for that. So we have some time for questions. So again, I'm going to encourage people to submit questions through the Q&A function. And I mean, just one very, very quick point of my own before we do that. I mean, I think the government and the department deserve some congratulations for sponsoring these monitoring reports, because essentially what they're doing, I mean, they are inviting an analysis of progress that has been made under the various integration strategies. Obviously, once you start doing that, you open the door to questions about how well you're doing, and you're allowing yourself to be critiqued. So I think it's a very sort of positive approach all in all to this question. And I think it's good that we have this sort of monitoring and that we have the engagement on policy issues over time. So just a point I was eager to make. So let me, Fran, pass the first question then over to you, and it's kind of picking up on a remark you were making. So Lucy Michael is asking if you could expand on the point about the Minister and the Anti-Racism Committee, that if they want to tackle racism, they need to measure it. So do you want to just say a little bit more about precisely what does that mean and what needs to be happening?
Yes, thanks for that question, Lucy. I suppose given my background, then I'm thinking primarily of outcomes and the fact that it's actually quite difficult to measure without measuring ethnicity on a sort of number of data sets, on survey data and administrative data. We don't actually know how different groups are doing in the labour market, in housing. We've made some efforts before, but my sort of major point is if we're going to be serious about addressing racism and discrimination, then we need to be measuring the outcomes of different ethnic groups in Ireland. Now, I've done a number of different studies using different methods, survey methods, looking at outcomes, looking at housing, looking at employment is not the only way. I've been involved in a field experiment. There's also in the labour market where you send out anonymous CVs to measure discrimination. There's also been a recent survey of housing discrimination, sorry, a recent experiment on housing discrimination. As part of work for the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, myself and Helen Russell and other ESRI colleagues have also looked at self-reports of discrimination, which is another way, which is where you say, have you experienced discrimination in the following situation in the past 2 years or since coming to Ireland? So, none of these measures are perfect, but together they give you a better sense of what is actually going on. Of course, as well, then qualitative research and recording incidents are also important. I mean, my point as a sort of empirical social researcher, speaking from the integration monitoring perspective, was that we can know quite a bit about the Irish non-Irish distinction, but apart from census data, we don't know very much about ethnicity, and this is important because many of the Black group, as Shannen mentioned, are actually Black Irish. Similarly with the Asian, they're Asian Irish. So they're not actually non-Irish nationals. So there is some overlap between nationality and ethnicity, but it's not the same thing. In case you're wondering why the deaths and cases were measured by ethnicity in a report on COVID and non-Irish nationals, this was particularly because the steering group of this programme asked us, because of evidence from both the US and the UK about the vulnerability of different ethnic groups to COVID infection and indeed COVID death, could we also look at ethnicity? And because the deaths and cases were kindly matched by the CSO to the census data, we did actually have ethnicity. We can't measure ethnicity anywhere else on the monitor. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, that's okay. You're allowed. Just actually picking up on that, I think it was noteworthy, and Shannen mentioned this, that there wasn't a higher death rate amongst those same ethnic groups as it seemed to have been observed in the United Kingdom. Any theories as to any explanation as to why this was the case?
I suppose, Alan, one thing, I mean, there are two main points here. One is the population is young. In the US and the UK, the population of most the ethnic minority groups are more similar to the white, what would be the white Irish population. But here in Ireland, that's not the case. These groups are much younger, and because age is so related to COVID death risk, that's one important point. The other thing I suppose Shannen also mentioned is these groups are very small. These are really very, very small groups in Ireland. Well, particularly travellers, the cases rate was high in travellers, but the group is small, and the Black ethnic group is quite small as well. 1.3, I think it is, % of the population. So that's it could be also that there are we're not allowed to say if there were less than five deaths, but it could be that this will yet this may yet emerge, but I think those are just two main things to keep in mind. And as Shannen said, I suppose we were in a sense, because it's not regularly published, because it's not in the computerized deaths and cases database that CSO manage, and they did sort of specially match it for us. We also don't have, not everybody on the deaths and cases database could be assigned an ethnicity, so there may be, or a nationality, so there may be some there that haven't been. But we can't actually look at, are they healthcare workers? What age are they? Are they have they got pre-existing health conditions? So we just can't do that then with the data we have.
There's a comment here from Sharif Lebrec, and I hope I pronounced the name correctly, but I won't read out the comment as much to try and give a sort of a synopsis. But I guess what the question has been raised is around this issue of whether or not we've engaged with migrant groups in the process of something like the monitor together. And I mean, I suppose that's there's suggesting in the questioning, you know, that a lot of the money, the funding in this area goes to NGOs rather than migrants themselves. Now, I'm not going to ask you to sort of address the bigger policy question, but on that question of, because you touched on it yourself there, Fran, qualitative research, are we doing enough in terms of actually engaging with the migrants themselves? And again, not if any you or any of the other colleagues might want to stab at the question.
I mean, I think certainly, for example, in thinking first in terms of policy, you know, in terms of consulting on the new strategy and engaging with migrant groups to bring those forward. To bring the ideas forward and to reflect on where policy has failed or where the migrant integration hasn't worked so well. I think it would be very important for anybody evaluating that strategy to speak to migrant groups about that. And whether the funding should be allocated to migrant groups, I suppose, you know, a lot of funding for the migrant integration strategy is directed towards NGOs, but I'm not, as I'm not a policymaker, I'm not sure exactly just how much goes to migrant groups. But of course, the other lesson, I think, if you took anything from the presentation on the integration monitor, is this is a very diverse group in Ireland. You know, speaking to one group of migrants is not may not tackle all the issues. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's all good. Another really interesting question. Again, sorry, Fran. I know it sounds like a lot of these are being directed to you, and they are. But again, the other colleagues should feel free to come in. But it's Katrina Macangasa, I think I probably pronounced incorrectly. But anyway, Katrina's question is along the following lines. Given that the monitor has been going now since 2010, do you have an overall sense of where has progress been made on integration and where has it not been made? Or is it the case that the results from, you know, if we look back now on the 2010 report, was there essentially a set of similar patterns?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one. I probably need my ESRI and EMN colleague Emma Quinn here. She's not on the panel, but has been involved in the integration monitoring exercise since the start. Probably the biggest change, or certainly the one that was most surprising for us, was that when we started monitoring in 2010, there was a massive backlog of citizenship applications. There had been a big wave of migration from non-EU countries. There were relatively you know, the conditions weren't so onerous in terms of how long you had to have lived there, sort of 5 of the last 7 years, but there was a tremendous backlog, and it seemed to us at the time that that this just would never be solved. And actually then suddenly it was, and there was a very, very large increase. Now, that's notwithstanding some issues resulting from a judgment this year, but I'd say certainly the most dramatic change since we started the integration monitor has been the acquisition of Irish citizenship by non-EU nationals, which, as I said, is seen as a sort of, well, it's not exactly a golden chalice, but I mean, it's sort of, in terms of membership at least, doesn't guarantee you integration. But in terms of what has changed, the employment rates, it is interesting that for most groups, prior to the pandemic, that the employment was hard hit by, especially of EU nationals during the recession, but then sort of was recovering, and employment rates in particular were well recovered, particularly for, say, EU East nationals just immediately prior to the pandemic. But then we have this group of African nationals who are still struggling in the labour market, and have that's been maintained. I suppose I would like to investigate more about the social inclusion and poverty, within that non-EU group, where I think the issues are lying, and we need to think creatively about how we use the poverty, the survey of income and living conditions, to find out more about these different non-EU groups.
Okay, and yes, Helen, you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to come in there. Yeah, I was going to say on the poverty one, it seems to be quite a consistent story over time in terms of the non-EU group being disadvantaged. So that's something that maybe we haven't seen change over the 10 years. And on the employment, yes, it tends to be that if the fortunes of migrants tends to fluctuate with the economy as well, which has gone through a lot of changes over the last 10 years. But it seems that the recessions tend to aggravate inequalities. So we saw with the Great Recession that the non-nationals were losing out more with the pandemic. Although it's early days, we're seeing particularly the EU East nationals losing out. So I think that's probably a pattern that we can see, having looked over the 10-year period.
This is kind of a related question, and again, Adriana Quinn. So I think the context of the question here is Adriana refers to this. Maybe there's a suggestion here that migrant native differences are maybe inevitable, okay, or that this is sort of something quite standard. And the question is, is it really possible to sort of alter integration or anti-discrimination policies, whereby you will actually have a significant impact on this issue? And I have often, if I can just develop the question a little bit myself, I mean, I wonder if you look across sort of history and you look across a range of countries, have countries been successful in this area? Or is there a sense that your best hope is to make sure that the next generation are fully integrated? You know what I mean? That if a group of people arrive in your country, without sort of, casting the group aside or not paying attention, but is it just fundamentally very difficult for policy to alter outcomes for the first generation, but that the hope is that you do things in such a way that by the time the second generation are moving through the system, that they have identical outcomes to the native population? So again, I don't know, Helen or Ivan or Shanna, any of you can take that one. Pretty broad question, I know. You're allowed, Fran. I was just trying to give you a break, but if you're eager to keep going, you can certainly do that.
I mean, well, maybe I'll say, a few words first. I suppose, yes, in research on migrant integration, Alan, as you will know, the integration of the second generation is often seen as a sort of litmus test of integration policy, and that's what can really be focused on. I guess I think there are examples of countries that have put a lot of effort into it and seen some results. I'm thinking one country is Portugal, which has maybe a similar similar general population size, history of migration in the sense of long history of emigration, and then inward migration, albeit mostly from South America, from Brazil primarily, but they have they have a government ministry and a special sort of integration ministry, and are targeting the resources where it's most needed. And I suppose at one level it's also fair to say that it's certainly not the case that the 500,000 non-Irish nationals are all doing badly, from this monitor. Far from it. So there's plenty of people who are doing fine. I think there definitely is room for many other countries have a more developed system of language training for adults, a language training as well established in schools in Ireland. But kind of hopeful that in COVID some of this might go online. But I think a lot of countries are doing a lot more in the language development front, and I do think, yes, that extra supports for people who've come through the protection system keeps recurring in the integration research that we do. So the idea that people would need some supports for labour market integration when their application is successful.
I think If I could just add to that, so yeah, so looking at policies for the first generation, I suppose the language supports is key, but also the recognition of qualifications from other countries, that seems to be a crucial one too. So, you know, there are areas where policies can make a difference.
Yeah, we know from the integration monitor that most migrants are actually educated abroad. There is a significant portion that are educated in Ireland, but the vast majority of working age are educated abroad. So it is very important for recognition of their qualifications. We didn't exactly get to measure a lot of look into first and second generation, with the exception of the PISA data. But we still saw that first generation migrants that didn't speak English in the background, as well as second generation migrants who didn't speak English at their home, had significantly lower scores on their English language. So you were still seeing the same effect regardless of the fact that it was first generation or second generation. So it just goes to show that we do need the English language supports.
I will just say something very quickly, that Jim Dalton in the chat has let us know that a lot of these measures on second generation sort of migrants will come into existence soon. So we should keep an eye on that.
Yeah, that's the labour force survey for the labour market indicators on the survey of income and living. Yeah, that's great. We work a lot with Jim on the labour force survey for both these projects. So thanks, Jim.
Okay, another issue, and it's Salome Mbagwa, who is, of course, an old friend of the Institute. But Salome is really sort of pointing very, very directly at the issue around the employment challenges for Africans, and just asking very bluntly, is it about discrimination? And in referring to another ESRI report, there seemed to be a mention of employer bias. So maybe that's yours again, Fran. I mean, is it just a simple fact that our African immigrants just are suffering the effects of discrimination?
It certainly seems likely from what we know already that a significant component of this may be discrimination. That's looking at the outcomes and then looking at what reports of what people themselves say of their experience of discrimination in recruitment and in the workplace. I would certainly hesitate to say that all of this disadvantage is discrimination. And for example, that report from June, Origin and Integration, suggested that for those who came through the asylum system, and there would be that's obviously you know, a broad Africans, Asians, and rest of the world, as we call them, but for African nationals who came through the protection system, and if their experience was traumatic, and if their stay there was prolonged, these factors may have meant that they would struggle as well. But then also questions of qualification recognition and other questions like that can play a role. I think one thing that would help us just from the integration monitoring perspective is that knowing the motives for migration, you know, because it is different whether you come to Ireland on a work permit or a critical skills permit. You know, you've got a job lined up, and you know, and if you came for other reasons and then were found yourself later for protection reasons or for family reasons or for study, and find yourself then looking for a job later. So I think yes, it's likely that discrimination racial discrimination is playing a role here in these outcomes, but it's not the only thing.
Yeah, and just to add quickly onto that point, that in the Integration Monitor report in Chapter 2, myself and Shannon did have to dig into this a little bit more because of the difference between African migrants and kind of other groups. And we do have a small model in that chapter in the appendix where we try to control for certain aspects of what could be causing the differences. And even when we consider for a couple of different things, including education, African migrants still report higher odds of unemployment. So it does seem to be that, that lots of the factors that we do consider, they don't explain that gap.
Yeah, thanks for that. Another question, it's a data-related question, and it's from Caroline Fennell. So regard to data measurement on ethnicity, is there an example of best practice internationally? So Fran, you kind of talked about the challenges of the ethnicity data, but who does this well, or what ideally are the sort of things that need to be collected?
Yeah, in terms of best practice internationally, I mean, there's a couple of principles, and one, of course, is self-identification. The countries that do it better tend to be the ones that have had substantial ethnic minority populations going back a long time. The minorities themselves have an identity which they then report. So it's easy to say. It's easy to know which answers, if you like, you know, which ethnicities, for example, in the UK, where Irish is also an ethnicity. So it responds, the measurement of ethnicity responds very much to the situation and also the history of the particular country. But I think because it's very much linked to someone's identity and what they feel themselves, any changes to the measurement of ethnicity in Ireland would need to involve those minorities themselves in developing a new measure, because yes, the measure we have doesn't let us do so much in terms of distinguishing different groups, but it's a tricky one. It's challenging, and it's particularly challenging to do cross-nationally because the groups are different in each of the countries.
And just to come in on that, one problem that we often see is ethnicity might be measured, but the survey is so small that we can't actually say anything about it. So we end up having to amalgamate groups. So we just have white Irish and other, and you can't really say anything substantive if the survey isn't large enough for us to be able to distinguish between different groups.
Okay, thanks for that, Shannon. And actually, I think Ivan is busily answering questions in the chat function. So well done, Ivan. A lot of ground to cover from when we're sitting here. So listen, it's coming close to 4 o'clock now, so we should really draw things to a close. So can I thank Fran and Shannon again for such great presentations. I won't list all the authors again, but just to thank them all for their important work on this. I want to thank the department, and as I said again, recognizing the move from the Department of Justice to the Department of Children. Again, I'm not going to try and remember all the various components of the department's new name, but we do look forward to continuing this relationship, because clearly it's a really, really important issue. Great that so many people logged on today. You know, hopefully in 2 years' time, I guess if we do the monitor every 2 years' time, you'd like to think that the next time we're talking about the monitor, that we'll be all together, unless something goes horribly wrong. So I know other reports are done on the program anyway, so we may be launching the next reports through this format. But anyway, hopefully before too long, we'll all be getting together. So with that, I'll just wish you all a good evening. And I guess since we're close to Christmas, if we're not talking, the best Christmas to everybody. Okay, so thanks so much, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.